Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for another SAGE Applied Research webinar series. Before I introduce this series, I would like to turn it over to Full Circle Interpreting so they can discuss how to listen to this webinar in Spanish.
Thank you, Andy. Yes, welcome to everybody. My name is Angelina, and I'm here with my colleague Murtado, and we'll be offering interpretation into Spanish of this session today. In order to listen in Spanish, please select your channel by going to the little world icon that appears in your Zoom control options, and then you can select Spanish. I will make this announcement in Spanish as well for our Spanish-speaking audience. Hola, bienvenidos. Esta sesión tiene interpretación al español. Si prefieren escuchar en español, por favor vayan al símbolo redondo de un mundo que aparece en sus controles de Zoom y seleccionen el canal de español. Esta opción está ubicada en su teléfono, en la parte de abajo, a mano derecha. Va a haber 3 puntitos, presione los 3 puntitos y luego se irá a interpretación, seguido por español y luego done o finalizar para poder escuchar. Muchas gracias y que disfruten la sesión en español. Hasta luego. Thank you, Andy. I've made the announcement for interpretation. Back to you.
All right, thank you so much. Well, everybody, hi, I am Dr. Andy Smolsky. I am a postdoctoral research scholar in the Department of Agricultural and Human Sciences at North Carolina State University. And I also am the Applied Research Director for the Southern Ag Exchange Network, a farm and ranch stress assistance network funded by the USDA. I'm here with my colleague and mentor, Dr. Michael D. Schulman, and today we will be presenting results recently published in the Journal of Agromedicine on a project we worked on around Black farmers and how they frame navigating farm stress. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Schulman to begin the presentation, and yeah, enjoy.
Thank you. And we do have a set of slides, so let's just get started throwing the screen. Thank you very much. Sorry, I have to click on something. What we're going to talk about today is some results from a collaborative research project that Dr. Smolsky and I participated in that was looking at particularly how small-scale, limited resource, socially disadvantaged farmers navigated farm financial and mental health crises. The purpose of the project was to try to understand the intersection of financial distress, land tenure, race, and emotional well-being, and to also come up with some recommendations for culturally relevant resources for farmers experiencing mental health and financial crises. The core funder for this project was Southern SARE. The lead institution was the Rural Advancement Fund International, otherwise known as RAFI. RAFI is a nonprofit based in Pittsboro, North Carolina, which operates a variety of programs, particularly directed at socially disadvantaged farmers. For example, they operate a Farmers of Color network. For more information, just go to their website. This was a community-engaged participatory project. In addition to researchers from NC State University and from the NC Agromedicine Institute and partners from RAFI, another nonprofit, the Land Loss Prevention Project, another organization, the National Center for Appropriate Technology, and several farmer collaborators were core members of the research team. Next slide. Before we begin, we just have to give some disclaimers. Clearly, Andy and I are not Black farmers. We're white academic researchers. We're not claiming to speak for all Black farmers. We're reporting on what we have learned from this project, which did involve speaking with and listening to Black farmers. and the opinions and views and interpretations that we're expressing are our own. They do not necessarily reflect those of the other project partners, SARE or NC State University. Next slide. So some background and framework, situating this research, particularly where Dr. Smolsky and I are coming from. If you're listening to this webinar, you probably don't need to be told that farm stress, farm suicide is a major social problem impacting farmers throughout the United States. For example, statistics from the Center for Disease Control show that farmers are 1.5 times higher, have higher 1.5 times higher suicide rates than the national average. There is a literature on farm stress, particularly in rural sociology, that goes back at least 40 or more years. For example, land-grant universities like Ohio State, Iowa State have been doing farm and rural life polls where they've been administering questionnaires that measure perceived stress, social support, and the adjustments that farmers and farm families have done to the stress that they're experiencing. So in situating our research, we're drawing upon particularly the rural sociological research on farm stress, and particularly the work that's been done by colleagues at Ohio State, Iowa State University. And actually in the 1980s, there was a team here at North Carolina State University. We were doing statewide surveys looking at how farm stress were impacting farmers throughout the state. The second body of literature that we draw upon in terms of situating our research is a literature on livelihood strategies. Now, a livelihood involves the capabilities, assets, and activities required for making a living. So when we talk about a livelihood strategy, we talk about how people utilize their assets, their resources to maintain and sustain their life chances. This oftentimes brings us into considerations of resilience. What adaptations do farm families make in response to financial stress to preserve their farm households, to preserve their farm operations, and to adjust to changing social and economic situations? Do they expand or decrease production? Do they retreat into subsistence? Do they engage in more off-farm labor to, again, to try to maintain the farm household and the farm operation in the face of financial distress? And thirdly, we draw upon a literature on agrarianism, particularly Black agrarianism. Agrarianism can be thought about as a worldview. In sociological lingo, we call it a frame. It's a worldview that oftentimes postulates agricultural life as fundamental for democracy, independence, and virtue. In a certain sense, agrarian beliefs and values can be traced back to Jefferson and the idea that family farming, widespread property ownership, and political decentralization are essential for democratic governance. We're not going back that far. We instead draw upon our colleagues in rural sociology who have basically talked about the different types of agrarian values, particularly the divergence between what might be called white or mainstream agrarian values and Black agrarianism. A colleague at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Dr. Jess Gilbert, for example, has, in his work, has shown that what we might call white agrarian attitudes are very individualistic and oftentimes point to individual blame as the causes for financial distress. On the other hand, Black agrarianism as a frame has values involving owning land and resistance to white domination, but also, in a sense, acknowledgement of the struggle over land involves structural racism and discrimination. Black Agrarian Frame also ties with the recent work of Monica White and Jessica Gorman Nemmerhard on collective resistance and cooperation and collective action. So we basically draw upon these three literatures in terms of how we develop the research instrument, the collaboration, and the community engaged project, and the results, which we're only going to talk about a slice of the results that we're going to talk about today. Next slide. So our core research questions from this study are, and this part of the study, it involve how do Black farmers frame their financial and emotional distress, and what livelihood strategies do they describe for navigating these stressors. So again, the core object of the project was to try to understand how farmers navigate financial distress, financial insecurity, and emotional distress. And in this sense, what we're trying to understand and what we're going to talk about in today's materials is a narrowing of that topic to the specific concerns and behaviors of Black farmers. Next slide. So methods. We actually began this work in April of 2020. I naively thought this was going to be about a 6-month project. It actually took close to 2 years to do the complete project. We had a subcontract with RAFI for the work at NC State. And what we formed was a community engaged project and research team. And in the sense that the core research team, which worked together on a weekly Zoom meeting, consisted of representatives of the farmer advocacy organizations, the universities, and 2 farmer collaborators. We had Mr. L and Ms. D, full-time members of the research team, participating in all the decisions and all the discussions. Now, all of our research instruments received approval from the NC State Institutional Review Board. Both our research instruments, the COVID protocols that we had to adhere to, because we were doing the interviewing during COVID, so all our interviewing was done by Zoom. NC State also went out of its way to provide IRB training for all our participants, even include those who are not part of the universities. We developed a 2-part questionnaire research protocol. One, a short screening questionnaire. The second, a much more detailed questionnaire containing both open-ended and closed-ended questions involving financial stress, livelihood strategies, and the adaptations that farmers made to the stress that they were experiencing. We used our farmer collaborators and our network contacts with Extension and other farm organizations to locate farmers who we interviewed. And these people we call farmer informants. We used our farmer informants, for example, we would discuss who we were interested in, type of person we were interested in interviewing. They would do their networks and contacts to locate people. So they might say, and they may call up farmer XYZ and say to her, there are these people from NC State and the Rural Advancement Fund who want to talk to you about participating in a research study. They're legitimate people. They're not trying to rip you off. So if they call, and if Mr. S calls or Ms. D calls, please listen to them. They're not scammers. We basically, had to use our informants and our informants network to, in a sense, find potential, our collaborators to find potential informants. Through this process, we contacted actually a total of 57 farmers, of whom 30 eventually agreed to participate, 15 Black and 15 white farmers. The results that we're going to talk about today are from our 15 Black farm informants. And there is, in a certain sense, we're not claiming this is a random sample or this is representative of all Black farmers in the Southeast. In particular, there was a community organization which included a farmer-to-farmer network, which was very helpful in terms of locating our farmer informants. So many of the Black farmers had participated in or had connections with this community organization. Next slide. Again, all our interviews were done with Zoom. We had a two-part interview. The first was a short screening questionnaire, had basic demographic questions, questions about the farm, and questions about whether or not they had experienced a financial distress in the previous 5 years. The short screening questionnaire also contained the informed consent. If the farmer informant agreed, we then scheduled a second, longer interview, which contained a mixed set of closed and open-ended questions. We drew upon several standard indicators of mental health and financial distress, but we also included many very open-ended questions. And even in the closed-ended questions, there was plenty of opportunity for the farmer informants to speak their mind and elaborate what they thought was going on. These open-ended and elaborations were coded, went through 3 rounds of coding using a software program called Deduce. Sample codes are on the slide. And then we also took the information from the closed-ended questions to compute some very simple descriptive statistics. Next slide. So just some simple descriptive statistics on the Black farmer informants. They came from North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. These, we would call them small-scale, limited resource farms. None of them met the definition of what the USDA would consider to be a commercial farm. There were 11 male and female operators. They predominantly used direct markets for, in a sense, selling their farm products. Over half had gross farm sales under 50K. About half had inherited the farm, and about half had been farming less than 10 years. And 21% had farms of less than 10 acres. So again, we would describe these as limited resource, small scale, family type, socially disadvantaged farmers. Next slide. We included some indices that have been used in a variety of farm surveys and farm stress instruments to try to get some information on quantitative data on distress and perceived economic hardship. These were closed-ended questions. where, for example, if someone said yes, they got a score of 1. If they said no, they got a score of 0. So high scores would indicate more symptoms of mental health problems, more psychological distress, more expressions of perceived economic hardship. We're not going to go into an elaborate quantitative analysis of the information. That's simply beyond our time and right now. But basically, as we looked at this data, we found that maybe close to half were, in a sense, scoring in the middle to medium high range when you summed up all of those individual indicators. In other words, they indicated that, yes, they had difficulty sleeping or a tendency to worry, that, yes, they often felt fearful, sad, or blue, or yes, they sometimes felt had difficulties finding that they had enough resources for medical care or for food. Next slide. We interpreted the quantitative results of the survey that, yes, indeed, some of our Black farmer informants were clearly experiencing current distress, but others were experiencing what we felt would be long-term chronic distress. And this is a question that we investigated or pursued more with the open-ended questions to try to understand, in a sense, their experience of long-term chronic crises and to understand the livelihood strategies that they develop to enhance and maintain their households and stay in farming. And I think this is when we do the tag team.
Yes. Thank you very much, Dr. Schulman. I'm going to talk about our qualitative and thematic results. What I want to note before I jump into those results is that the themes are not in rank order. As discussed during the method slide a little bit, these themes arose from rounds of coding, the interviews, and so they're kind of built from the data itself. There are 2 thematic sets that I'm going to report on. One focused on the racism as a traumatic stressor and how this is perceived. The second centers the livelihood strategies farmers discussed as a response to racism and specific stressors that may be more general to farming. And also, it is important to note that while racism is a key organizing element to how many Black farmers we interviewed discussed stress, it is not the only stressor and should not be treated as a monolithic experience of all Black farmers. The first theme that I discuss is the role of discrimination from society and how it in general impacts how Black farmers perceive farming and coping with the stress. Principally, the historical experience of being Black in America, and more concretely being a Black farmer, are considered to be invisibilized or marginalized. This raises an added barrier to seeking resources and support because, as the quote describes in this box, it means the service provider is understood to operate antagonistically toward the Black farmer they should serve. Additionally, and to read the quote, what the farmer informant stated was, you literally have to tell them what it is to be Black, and they still really don't understand. They don't want to understand, but you can tell by about the whitish things that they say, they really don't know what we deal with. And so, additionally, this theme of generalized discrimination is also about the role that unequal ownership has in increasing the vulnerability, fragility, and risk of Black farmers. The second quote on this slide highlights this inequality, and I will return to this risk of asset loss in different moments of this presentation. as the farmer informant said, to read aloud, we cannot change this landscape in this country as long as 98% of the land is owned by people who don't look like us and aren't serving our population. The second theme continues framing discrimination as a stressor, while this time linking it to more concrete set of institutions perceived to have power over regulatory processes that impact access to resources. Specifically, this was a discussion of distrust and discrimination with USDA and its affiliated organizations like FSA. It is about how power is applied arbitrarily that puts the farm at risk and how that shapes this access to resources. So this doesn't have to be direct either in each instance. At times, this narrative is discussed as a matter of indirect experience, a collective experience. So the first quote on this slide is discussing it as an indirect experience of racial discrimination and distrust of institutions. That is, as he said, as they said, based off from what I've read and what I've heard, the USDA was, if you applied for a loan as a Black farmer, 360 days, as a white farmer, 30 days. Banks are as bad for Black folks. You can be twice as good and you still won't get stretched way out. In the other instance, in terms of arbitrary application of power, it was a matter of a direct experience. As the farmer informant reported, I was calling him on it and it was really annoying him. And at one point he was like, well, you keep saying all these guidelines. I don't have to follow that. I have discretion. Basically saying that he can do what he wants and he doesn't need to follow FSA guidelines. So in this instance, the general moves towards a concrete effect in terms of institutional racism, as the sociological literature talks about it. The next theme was then about how that experience could turn into assets at risk and the dispossession of Black farmers from their land. Basically increasing financial risk, which could be at times tied to the aforementioned institutional racism. It did not automatically have to place race-based parameters. It could be expressed in instrumental terms relative to finance, markets, and debt, such as in the quote here, because of lack of finance in different things, and then not having access to markets. And then some of them go into a whole lot of debt. He's probably in his 60s, you know, talking about another farmer informant that they knew who was experiencing financial crisis. But it was oftentimes described in race-based terms as how this increased risk of farm loss, which then meant the loss of Black farmers. And this is not about the exactitude of what is expressed. For instance, this quote, which I'll read shortly, actually have numbers that are better than the reality according to the Census of Agriculture in 2017. Instead, it is about how farmers framed a connection between financial risk, asset loss, and the loss of Black farmers relative to discrimination. So this farmer informant stated, we had at the turn of the century, Black people had 15 million acres under ownership. Think by the time Barack Obama was president, I believe we had less than 7 million. We lost half of what we had. And so this asset risk also becomes a risk in terms of social ties, in terms of our last theme relative to that traumatic dimension that farmers experience, that Black farmer informants experience in our study, in which they discuss a sense of a town and country divide, whereby Black farmers related how family members, friends, other community members may not support their decision to continue farming, that when financial crisis occurs, to push them off the farm, that other family members may push them to sell the farm, and tend to relate the experience of agriculture to the historical experience of enslavement in the United States as represented in this quote. in which the farmer informant reported being told, Black people have what I call an anti-agricultural backlash because they relate farming to slavery. Furthermore, there was a framing of how research is analyzing the reality of the intergenerational loss of Black farmers while not reversing these trends. As one farmer described, it is post-loss research that does not repair the damage. They're researching, doing this, but the bottom line is the boat is still sinking. You're studying that. There's a lot of people falling in the water. You know, that's it. I mean, stuff like this maybe should have been done 25 years ago. And so this all conjoins into a narrative of stress that Dr. Schulman was getting at in terms of the literature is related to a system blame, a discussion of how racialized discrimination overlaying financial risk leads to asset loss and the loss of Black farmers in general and an increasing social isolation. But that's one dimension. And this is the crucial part, that while there is framing in the interviews of the role that racism and the loss of Black farmers has shaped a traumatic experience, this frame was presented in conjunction with livelihood strategies that Black farmers employ to sustain their farms and counter this stress. That is an important addition and links to what Dr. Schulman was discussing in terms of the work by scholars like Monica White around collective resilience. Specifically, the first theme in this livelihood set is the role of Black farmer solidarity and cooperation. In one form, this is about the relationship between Black farmers and how this forms a basis for collective action and access to economic resources. This can be through the development of cooperatives, as exemplified in this quote by a farmer informant. I'm the youngest, one of the youngest African Americans in the industry today, but I do have a body of youth, right at 200 head of youth that actually are engaged in agriculture, that are part of the farm co-op, which, like I say, I own that. It's just called, in brackets, cooperative. It is also about farmer-to-farmer networking that can lead to on-farm demonstrations, connections with formal institutions, and an increasing sense of collective efficacy to address challenges Black farmers face. That sense of being able to join together and make demands upon a system and thereby access resources. That in part was linked to institutional support by building bridges between Black farmers and advocacy organizations focused on issues like legal services for heirs property that Black farmers can confront. In a sense, Black farmers have developed parallel organizations that address their concerns and enable the continuation of their livelihoods as Black farmers. And the first quote on this slide, that is a discussion of an economic program brought about by this bridging. So like there's a place down in a city called Organization, there's a couple places, and you know they're looking to purchase food. And this was related to a farm box program. So aggregation occurring, thereby increasing farm sales. The other discussion is, and we talked about being with them about 4 years as the farm practice and resource coordinator. So I work with farmers all throughout the Southeast and parts of the Caribbean as well. Therefore, not just locating farmers, Black farmer informants in a specific locale, but extending to build a regional network. And I'd like to go back real quick because I don't believe I read the other quote, and I would like to make sure that it's also translated. When they were talking about Black farmer solidarity and that farmer to farmer network, another Black farmer informant reported, "We have different farmers that we work with, try to work together. That's in the area, and we'll try to call around and see who has what equipment and how we can get it to the different farms, just to kind of work as a teamwork, because we are all small producers," right? That sense of collective action in order to address possible deficits by leveraging existing assets. Furthermore, the farm is seen as a source of wealth and productive capacity. Black farmer informants reported the farm as an asset because it can produce food for the household, which in turn allows for using household economic resources for other costs of living, as represented in this quote. If I got to choose between eating or paying a bill, if I grew my food, I ain't got to worry about making that decision because I can go out in the garden and get what I want. Additionally, the farm itself is conceived of as wealth because it is an asset that can be utilized to create wealth through multiple other forms for economic gain, with other farmers noting activities such as hunting and timber that the farm is capable of making possible. This is an added reason why possible asset loss is a stressor, because it would remove this livelihood strategy from their toolbox for sustaining themselves as farmers. As this farmer stated, I started farming because I think it's generating wealth. You could build something here, and my goal is to buy more land. And I would like to note on top of this, how that is an intergenerational understanding of wealth creation. Not just in this quote, but in the way it was discussed in many of the interviews as linking together a resource across generations. The last livelihood strategy that I would like to discuss, although not the only one that came out of our study, the frugality and avoidance is about how the Black farmer informants framed a strategy to not incur debt by seeking to rely on existing financial capital or choosing not to expand production. This may not mean avoiding all debt, as shown in this quote, so you stay away from getting a high debt load, but that's the way I was trained, but seeking to not have a debt load that would put their assets at risk. This frugality framing was also tied into a strategy of avoiding institutions like USDA that are perceived to discriminate against Black farmers and increase their likelihood of losing the farm or parts of the farm, as represented in this quote, hindsight is 2020. But you know, if we had to do it over again, I would definitely say to not just accept what USDA FSA says. It also means adjusting how Black farmers relate to these institutions when they do interact. That can be reinforcing the Black farmer solidarity and cooperative frame. I'd also like to point out that this is not an absolute avoidance. Black farmer informants in our study, and also we know anecdotally, have and do interact with NRCS and other organizations linked to USDA. Rather, it can be considered a tactical strategy dependent upon their understanding of how the USD operates in their community. Therefore, the themes together demonstrate a set of livelihood strategies framed by collective action to leverage the farm economically, socially, and environmentally to maintain a Black farming community. These themes taken together then are indicative of a Black agrarian frame to understand Black farmer stress and livelihood strategies. As noted in prior literature on Black agrarianism, there's a collective experience of white oppression of Black farmers linked to racism and discrimination. Our data support that this finding as a way Black farmers frame stress. Additionally, there was a sense that because of the intergenerational loss engendered by this historical experience, that Black farmers cannot be made whole again, that proposed remedies are post-loss and sustaining the existing situation for the Black farmers that continue to farm as a paramount objective. In addition, there are these livelihood strategies that we reported from our analysis of the Black farmer informant data. First, following from the scholarship on Black agrarianism, land remains a source of liberation, framed as a source of wealth and productive capacity, one that can permit frugality and avoidance when necessary to sustain the farm. And the solidarity and cooperation Black farmers employ is noted in this literature as a communal orientation whereby social support becomes a collective action to resist white oppression and continue farming. Therefore, based on this, we can consider a set. First, discriminated is perceived as increasing risk for Black farmers by impeding access to resources and leading to asset loss. Second, the traumatic dimension of Black agrarianism is also part of a sense of isolation and intergenerational loss. Third, Black farmer solidarity, land ownership, and frugality are deployed as specific livelihood strategies to sustain the farm and the family. Therefore, there is evidence for a unique set of financial and emotional stressors and strategies that Black farmers use to navigate distress. In that, it may mean that the literature on farm stress should be more inclusive of the Black agrarian literature to understand how racism is a stressor and how racial solidarity frames out a set of livelihood strategies that mediates the response to farm stress. In a sense, it's to state that the farm stress literature needs to differentiate the occupational category of farmer based upon the lived experience within a racialized United States. And in that sense, become culturally grounded and produce resources relative to that cultural grounding, thereby increasing possibly their efficacy and utility and benefit for the populations they're meant to serve. Now, as with any research study, there are limitations that should be highlighted. In this case, our data represent a possibly non-representative sample, as Dr. Schulman alluded to earlier, based on the networks we were able to access, working in conjunction with our community engaged team. We should ask, how generalizable are these livelihood strategies for Black farmers? We interviewed 15 Black farmer informants. Are these findings going to be found in the larger population of more than 40,000 Black farmers in the United States? In addition, and building on the prior question, is the Black agrarian frame in terms of extent and magnitude, as laid out in this study, to be found within these general Black farmer populations, especially when thinking about the role of the community-based organization. How important is a community and organizational basis for the Black agrarian frame, both in its traumatic dimension and the livelihood strategies that were discussed? Prior literature on the Black agrarian frame has focused on specific communities when discussing this frame and the collective action around them. Therefore, there is an open question about the role and necessity of that organizational basis, one to be explored further. Answers to these questions will have important ramifications for practitioners working to address Black farmer stress, making them avenues for further research. And not just Black farmer stress. If framing is something that is impacting how farmers in general navigate stress, a question Dr. Schulman and I continue to explore, and now a more comparative project with white and analyzing white farmers and the Black farmers. And if a frame has an organizational basis, this really opens up new understandings, or maybe not new, let's not oversell it. It opens up different understandings that the literature may point towards, and therefore different ways that we could work with farmers to navigate stress and have more beneficial outcomes. with that, I'd like to say thank you to everybody. And I hope you have a wonderful, well, this will be a recording, so I'm going to say wonderful week because it's the beginning of the week. But thank you for attending another SAGE Applied Research webinar. Before we shut down, I'd like to open it up to questions. If you have questions, please place them in the chat. Otherwise, have a good day. And I'll stop sharing while I wait for those questions.